Tonight, we journey into the shadows, unraveling stories of terrifying encounters with entities from realms beyond. If you think you're brave enough, join us as we delve into accounts that defy logic and chill the soul. But beware, each tale serves as a haunting reminder that some doors should remain closed. Title: Echoes of Hunger. The late-night art class at Wacko University had a distinct air, one that Hiroshi Sato often found intoxicating. The yellowish flicker of the overhead lights cast shadows along the walls, creating elongated shapes that he felt revealed hidden dimensions. In his small desk, cluttered with worn sketches and charcoal smudges, Hiroshi sat hunched, his pencil scraping carefully over the paper as he observed the human form before him. The professor's voice droned on about anatomy, proportions, and classical techniques, but Hiroshi's mind wandered. He wasn't particularly interested in the technicalities of art. Instead, he found himself drawn to the essence of his subjects, the deeper, unspoken secrets that their bodies seemed to hold. To him, every curve, every hollow, every imperfection was a world waiting to be explored, and perhaps possessed. Among the students, his attention constantly drifted to the foreign exchange students. They seemed different, their features striking, as though carved from another era. And among them was Lena, a young German woman who often sat near the back, lost in her own world. She was tall, with pale skin and dark hair that framed her face in a way that seemed almost ethereal. Tonight, as he sketched, he found himself unable to look away from her. He watched the way her hands moved across her notebook, her slender fingers capturing details he imagined seeing up close. His pencil scratched across the page, drawing her form from memory, a form that had lingered in his thoughts for weeks. Each stroke of graphite was a silent homage to the fascination she invoked, and each glance she cast away was another wound he felt keenly. Mr. Sato. The professor's voice pulled him abruptly from his reverie, breaking the spell Lena had unknowingly cast over him. Are you listening? Hiroshi straightened up, clearing his throat, his fingers tightening around his pencil. Yes, sensei, he replied, but his mind was already wandering back. That insatiable curiosity was more than an artistic intrigue. It was something much darker, something that gnawed at him in the quiet moments, something that he could neither explain nor deny. As the class ended and students filed out, he lingered behind, watching Lena slip into the night. Her footsteps echoed down the corridor, and he couldn't resist the pull to follow, keeping just far enough to blend into the shadows. The campus coffee shop was bustling the next day, filled with laughter and chatter that seemed to mask the more somber thoughts Hiroshi carried. He saw her there again, seated by the window, bathed in natural light that softened her features. She was sketching in a small notebook, completely absorbed in her own world. Her presence had a stillness to it, an untouched beauty that seemed removed from the chaos around her. Gathering his nerve, Hiroshi approached her table, rehearsing a casual line in his mind. Do you mind if I sit here? He asked, his voice softer than he intended. Lena looked up, surprised, her eyes briefly scanning him before she nodded. Sure, she replied, her accent a blend of familiarity and foreignness. He settled into the seat across from her, feeling a pulse of satisfaction. Here, so close to her, he felt he could glimpse the details he had obsessed over, the faint freckles on her nose, the delicate veins in her hands. He struggled to keep his expression neutral, masking the intensity of his fascination. You're in the art program, right? He began, trying to keep his voice light. Yes, she replied, her voice polite but distant, as though she sensed something beneath his calm demeanor. They exchanged a few more words, and Hiroshi's questions started to grow a bit too personal. Details about her routine, her art, her time in Tokyo. Lena's eyes darted around, and Hiroshi sensed her discomfort. "Well, I should be going," she said, gathering her things quickly. As she left, he felt a pang, a sense of loss as her presence slipped away. But in that moment, his obsession solidified, intensifying with each step she took away from him. She was no longer just an inspiration. She was something he wanted to capture, possess, and perhaps something more. The confines of his small apartment became his sanctuary and his prison. Hiroshi paced between stacks of books, sketchpads filled with detailed anatomy studies, and the blank canvases that lined the walls. Here he could retreat into his world, undisturbed by the outside. Yet tonight, that restlessness simmered beneath the surface, fueled by every thought of Lena. He took out a sketchbook and began to draw her face, piecing together details he had observed in fleeting moments. Each pencil stroke seemed to bring her closer, but it was never enough. The stillness of her image mocked him, leaving him wanting more. Hiroshi's obsession spiraled into a plan, something that initially shocked even him. But as the thought took shape, he found himself rationalizing it as a necessary step in his artistic pursuit. If he could just be closer to her, study her in a way that he couldn't in the light of day, maybe he could understand the depths of his fascination. The thought unsettled him, yet it also thrilled him, an excitement mingled with dread. But in his mind it was justified. This was about art, about understanding beauty in its rawest, truest form, or so he convinced himself. The night was thick with silence when Hiroshi made his way to Lena's apartment building. He moved quickly, his footsteps careful, deliberate, as he navigated the dimly lit hallways. The thrill coursed through him, a forbidden pulse that urged him onward. His breathing grew shallow, each step amplifying his anticipation. Reaching her door, he paused, steadying himself. A faint light seeped from beneath, but no sound came from within. She was asleep, he was sure of it. His fingers trembled as he nudged the door open, the small creak setting his nerves on edge. His senses heightened, the ticking of a clock, the distant hum of a refrigerator, the quiet rustle of fabric as he stepped into her room. There she lay, breathing softly, a figure of vulnerability and beauty. He watched her for what felt like an eternity, drinking in every detail, feeling the pull between reverence and hunger. A small glint caught his eye, a knife on the countertop, almost within reach. He moved forward, his hand outstretched, but then she stirred. Her eyes opened, locking onto him with a look of horror that shattered his composure. She screamed, a piercing sound that jolted him back to reality. Panic surged through him, his plans unraveling as quickly as they had formed. Before he knew it, he was running, fleeing into the cold, empty streets, her scream echoing in his mind. Back in his apartment, Hiroshi sat in the darkness, the remnants of his failed attempt clawing at his mind. Her scream, her terrified expression, they replayed in his thoughts, haunting him, a bitter reminder of his own weakness. The following day, the police came, questioning him, and he kept his answers brief, letting his father's influence and wealth handle the rest. Lena's accusations were quieted, buried under an out-of-court settlement, but Hiroshi's shame only deepened. He felt exposed, yet emboldened, as though this experience had stripped away the last of his hesitations. The weeks that followed were an uneasy blend of anticipation and restlessness. Hiroshi couldn't escape the memory of Lena's terrified expression or the sound of her scream, and he replayed the encounter in his mind, a strange mix of fear and fascination gnawing at him. Though she had reported the incident, Hiroshi's family influence ensured that the matter remained out of the public eye. Still, the feeling of exposure lingered, casting a shadow over his days. Determined to regain control over his life and his art, Hiroshi resumed his routine with a renewed intensity. He continued his sketches, using the fragments of memory he had of Lena to recreate her image over and over again. Each line and curve of her form became an obsession, a need that he could not fulfill no matter how many times he drew her. The art classes and everyday interactions became mere distractions, mere fillers of time that kept him from indulging in his true pursuit. He avoided the coffee shop, the library, and anywhere he might see her. But when he caught glimpses of her on campus, a surge of longing and resentment rose within him. Hiroshi's obsession was no longer about art or inspiration. It had become a need to know her, to truly possess her presence in a way he could control. One rainy afternoon, as he stood in front of his apartment window, Hiroshi found himself forming a new plan. This time he wouldn't rush. He would take his time, learn more about her, and, above all, remain unseen. It wasn't enough to draw her from a distance. He needed to understand every detail of her life, from the mundane to the private, so that he could bring her image to life in his own way. Thus began his nightly rituals, where he followed her from afar, hidden in the shadows of the narrow streets and alleys. He observed her routine, watching how she spent her evenings, which cafes she frequented, and even the quiet walks she took in the nearby park. The more he learned, the deeper his obsession grew. Every glance, every gesture, every moment she spent alone became etched into his memory, fueling his desire to create a perfect replica of her likeness on paper. One evening, after following her back to her apartment, Hiroshi noticed a dimly lit path leading away from her building. He had never seen her walk this path before, and his curiosity piqued. He decided to take the path, following the direction she had gone. The trail led him through a dense cluster of trees, an area that seemed far removed from the bustling city. As he walked, he could hear the sounds of the city fading away, replaced by an eerie quietness. The path eventually led him to a small clearing, where Lena was standing alone, her face turned up toward the darkening sky. She appeared to be lost in thought, her features softened by the fading light. Hiroshi held his breath, captivated by her solitude. He knew he was too close, but he couldn't tear his gaze away. The sight of her standing there, completely unaware of his presence, stirred something deep within him. In that moment, he felt a sense of intimacy, as though he was seeing a side of her that no one else could. He stayed hidden, watching her until she turned and walked back along the path. The encounter left him feeling exhilarated, and he returned to his apartment with a newfound resolve. Over the next few weeks, Hiroshi's behavior grew more erratic. He skipped classes, spending his days locked in his apartment, surrounded by sketches of Lena in various states of expression. His obsession had taken on a life of its own, consuming him entirely. He no longer cared about the consequences. All he wanted was to capture her essence, to make her a permanent part of his world. Late one night, as he was sketching, he realized that his drawings were no longer enough. He needed something more, something tangible. The thought frightened him, but the desire was too strong to ignore. His mind drifted back to the memory of her skin, the faint scent he had caught during their brief encounter in the coffee shop. He wanted to feel that closeness again, to be near her in a way that was beyond mere observation. Driven by this need, he began to gather items that would allow him to recreate the intimacy he craved. A strand of her hair he had found near her usual seat in the library, a small piece of fabric she had discarded, a broken pen he had seen her use. Each item became a symbol of his obsession, a piece of her that he could keep close. Yet, as he collected these items, a sense of dread began to creep in. He was aware of the danger, aware that his actions were crossing a line that he could never return from. but the thrill of possessing these pieces of her outweighed any fear he might have felt. One evening, as he was following her down a quiet street, Hiroshi noticed a group of students from their university approaching. He quickly ducked into an alleyway, watching from a distance as Lena greeted them, her face lighting up with a smile. The sight of her happiness stirred something dark within him. He had never seen her smile like that before, and the realization filled him with jealousy. Unable to contain his emotions, Hiroshi waited until the group had left, then approached her. His voice barely a whisper. "Lena," he called, startling her. She turned, her expression one of surprise mixed with apprehension. "Hiroshi?" she said, her voice hesitant. "What are you doing here?" I wanted to talk to you," he replied, struggling to keep his voice steady. "I wanted to apologize for everything." She took a step back, her gaze wary. "It's fine, Hiroshi, really, but I think it's best if we keep our distance." Her words cut through him, and he felt a surge of anger mixed with despair. She didn't understand. She couldn't understand the depth of his feelings, the lengths he had gone to be close to her. Without thinking, he reached out, grabbing her arm. "Lena, please," he whispered, his voice tinged with desperation. "Just give me a chance to explain." But she pulled away, her expression turning to one of fear. "Let go of me, Hiroshi," she said, her voice trembling. Realizing what he had done, Hiroshi released her, his heart pounding. She hurried away, leaving him standing alone in the darkness, his mind racing with a mixture of shame and rage. The following days passed in a haze. Hiroshi knew he had crossed a line, but the encounter had only strengthened his obsession. He couldn't let her go, not now, not after everything he had done. He was consumed by a need to make her understand, to show her the depth of his devotion. One night, he made his way to her apartment building, his mind clouded by a dangerous mix of longing and desperation. He knew what he was about to do was wrong, but he could no longer control himself. His obsession had taken over, driving him to a point of no return. He slipped into the building, making his way to her apartment door. His hands trembled as he reached for the handle, his heart pounding in his chest. This time he wouldn't run. This time he would make her see him, truly see him. But as he stood there, the reality of his actions began to sink in. He was about to cross a line he could never come back from, a line that would change his life forever. For the first time, he felt a surge of fear, a realization that he was on the brink of something dark and irreversible. As he turned to leave, he heard footsteps approaching, and his heart froze. He ducked into the shadows, watching as Lena walked down the hallway, her expression weary and distant. He waited until she had entered her apartment, then slipped away into the night, his mind racing with conflicting emotions. In the days following Hiroshi's near confrontation with Lena, he spiraled further into isolation. His sketches of her littered his apartment, capturing every expression he remembered and imagined, each one a mirror reflecting his deepening obsession. But despite the countless hours he spent drawing, something essential seemed to be missing, something that prevented him from fully capturing her essence. The hollow emptiness gnawed at him, making each moment without her increasingly unbearable. Haunted by their last interaction, Hiroshi decided he could no longer watch from a distance. He needed a way to make Lena see him, not as a distant, disturbed admirer, but as someone who understood her in ways no one else could. He convinced himself that he was different from others who admired her, that his feelings were profound, even noble. Yet he knew that his actions were beginning to attract attention. Rumors started to circulate at the university. Fellow students and professors noticed Hiroshi's absence from class. and his increasingly strange behavior, particularly his tendency to be wherever Lena was. Though he tried to be discreet, his desperation clouded his judgment, and he found himself taking greater risks, following her openly in ways that drew worried looks and hushed whispers. His art professors, once praising his unique vision, now began to see him as unpredictable and troubled. The tension weighed on Hiroshi, but he continued, convinced that his path was justified. He waited for the perfect moment, an opportunity to approach Lena in a way that would force her to recognize the connection he felt. One evening, he overheard a conversation between Lena and her friends. They were discussing a weekend trip they planned to take, a short retreat to a nearby coastal town where they could unwind from the pressures of school. Hiroshi's pulse quickened at the thought. This was his chance to be close to her without the familiar setting of the campus or her usual places around the city. The night before the trip, Hiroshi meticulously prepared. He arranged his belongings and packed a small bag with the essentials. He rented a room in a guest house near the area where Lena and her friends would be staying. He convinced himself that he only wanted to observe her from afar, that being in her presence, even if unnoticed, would satisfy the yearning that had taken over his life. But deep down, he knew this was more than just an escape. It was a calculated decision to bring himself into her world. As he arrived in the coastal town, he felt a strange sense of peace wash over him. The salty air and the sound of waves seemed to calm the chaos in his mind. He walked along the shoreline, imagining what it would be like to walk beside Lena, to hear her laughter mingling with the sound of the ocean. It was almost as if he had entered another reality, one where his desires were no longer hidden in the shadows, but brought to life by his surroundings. He spent the day observing from a distance, watching as Lena and her friends laughed and took pictures, their carefree energy contrasting sharply with his solitary presence. As the evening sun dipped below the horizon, Hiroshi's sense of urgency intensified. He felt that this was his last opportunity to bridge the gap between them, to reveal himself and let her see the person who had devoted so much of his life to understanding her. That night, after Lena's friends had retired to their rooms, Hiroshi made his way toward the small beach where he had seen her sitting earlier. He was surprised to find her there, alone, staring out at the water, lost in thought. The sight of her solitude, her vulnerability in that quiet moment, emboldened him. This was the moment he had been waiting for. He approached slowly, making enough noise to announce his presence without startling her. She turned, her face briefly registering surprise, then confusion. "Hiroshi?" she asked, her voice cautious. "What are you doing here?" I just wanted to talk to you," he replied, struggling to keep his voice steady. "To explain myself. I know it seems strange, but I've been watching you because I feel something deep, something real." Her eyes narrowed, and she took a step back. "Hiroshi, this isn't right. I don't know you like that. It's not normal." He felt the sting of her words but pressed on, desperate to make her understand. "But you don't see it, Lena. I understand you more than anyone else does. I've studied you, watched how you move, how you think. I've drawn you so many times that I feel like I know every part of you." Lena's face turned pale, a mixture of fear and disbelief filling her eyes. "You don't know me, Hiroshi. Whatever you think you feel, it's not real. You're just obsessed." The word hit him like a slap. Obsessed. It was the one word he had avoided, the one truth he couldn't accept. His hands trembled, and he felt a surge of anger mixed with despair. "No, Lena, it's not obsession. It's devotion," he whispered, more to himself than to her. Lena took another step back, her expression hardening. "Stay away from me, Hiroshi. This is over. Whatever this is, it stops here." In that moment, Hiroshi realized the depth of his delusion. His carefully constructed reality shattered, and he was left with nothing but the emptiness he had been trying to fill. He stood there, watching as she walked away, the sound of her footsteps fading into the night. The days following the confrontation were a blur. Hiroshi returned to the city, his mind in a fog, unable to process what had happened. He withdrew further into himself, shutting out the world and spending his days in silence. His art, once a source of solace, now felt hollow and meaningless. Rumors about him spread through the university, and he could feel the weight of judgment from those around him. He was no longer the talented artist with a mysterious edge. He was the disturbed student, the outcast. His professors expressed their concern, and even his family began to question his behavior, urging him to seek help. But Hiroshi couldn't bring himself to confront the truth. He had lost the one thing that had given his life purpose, and without it, he was adrift. In his solitude, he spiraled deeper into despair, unable to escape the memory of Lena's rejection. Her words echoed in his mind, a constant reminder of his failure. Obsessed. The word haunted him, a painful truth he could no longer deny. He was left with nothing but his drawings, each one a fragment of a life he could never have, a life he had destroyed with his own hands. Hiroshi eventually left the university, unable to bear the weight of his actions. He retreated to his family's home, a shadow of the person he once was. His art supplies gathered dust, untouched in the corner of his room. He no longer found solace in drawing. Instead, he felt a deep sense of shame and regret for the person he had become. Lena moved on, her life untouched by the darkness that had consumed Hiroshi. She graduated, pursued her dreams, and found happiness, leaving behind the memory of the troubled artist who had once followed her. For Hiroshi, however, the memory of her would remain, a painful reminder of the obsession that had destroyed his life. In the end, Hiroshi was left with nothing but the knowledge of his own downfall, a cautionary tale of a mind consumed by its own illusions, and a reminder that some lines, once crossed, can never be retraced.